Imagine this scene. You're dragging yourself through the frozen muck of central Gaul. Complete darkness surrounds you. You're a courier attempting to sneak beyond the fortress walls to summon reinforcements. The field ahead appears completely smooth, an escape route to safety. You inhale deeply, steel your nerves, and commit to the dash. Without warning, the earth turns traitor, no indication whatsoever. Your limb drops into a concealed shaft, and a bone-chilling snap reverberates through the silence. This isn't a simple sprained ankle. You've descended into a lily trap, a Roman engineering horror where a fire-hardened oak spike lurks inside a cone-shaped cavity engineered precisely to obliterate the tibia of anyone reckless enough to sprint across it. Agony detonates through your leg, overwhelming and complete. You react instinctively and attempt to wrench yourself free, but the hook design of the shaft only wedges your shattered limb deeper. You're immobilized, defenseless, and then, from the blackness 50 paces distant, you detect the steady, measured breathing of a Roman centurion. He doesn't require combat to defeat you. The landscape has already crushed you. This is the nightmare reality of the Siege of Alesia. It isn't a confrontation of blades and armor. It's an extermination by excavation and deprivation. Before we examine the savage brilliance behind these devices, if you appreciate discovering the grimmer tactical realities of warfare, please smash that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment below. Do you believe ingenuity or bravery determines wars? I examine every comment, and I'm fascinated to discover where you stand. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar confronted the inconceivable. He was stranded deep in hostile terrain, drastically outnumbered, and his entire career balanced on a razor's edge. Opposing him stood Vercingetorix, the warlord of the Gauls, a commander who had finally unified the fractured tribes and now occupied the commanding heights of the colossal plateau of Alesia with 80,000 fighters. Vercingetorix possessed the elevated position. He controlled the provisions. He commanded superior numbers. He anticipated Caesar would launch a desperate, suicidal assault up the hillsides, a death march that would terminate Roman ambitions in Gaul permanently. But Caesar refused to attack. He surveyed the mountain stronghold and chose to revolutionize the principles of combat. He commanded his 50,000 legionaries to cease advancing and begin excavating. If he couldn't defeat Vercingetorix in direct combat, he would simply eliminate the battlefield itself. The Romans initiated a construction endeavor of psychotic proportions. They surrounded the entire mountain with an 11-mile ring of defensive works. But these weren't merely barriers. They were an elaborate killing zone of excavations, rerouted waterways, and those nightmarish concealed devices. Caesar wasn't merely constructing a fence. He was constructing an apparatus to pulverize the Gallic will into powder. Vercingetorix, observing from the ramparts, comprehended the snare too late. He witnessed the Roman stranglehold constricting and executed his only surviving strategy. Before the circle sealed completely, he dispatched his cavalry through a vulnerable point in the defences. Their objective wasn't to engage, but to escape, to ride to the distant corners of Gaul and mobilize a colossal relief force, a host of over 250,000 warriors to annihilate Caesar from the rear. Caesar observed them flee. He recognized the countdown had commenced. He understood a tsunami of enemies was approaching to obliterate him. Most commanders would withdraw. Caesar instead executed something deranged. He commanded his troops to construct a second barrier, this time oriented outward. The Romans were now effectively imprisoning themselves inside a ring of fortifications, preparing to be assaulted by 80,000 frantic warriors from within and 250,000 enraged fighters from without. The predator had deliberately transformed into the prey. To comprehend the scale of the catastrophe developing at Alesia, we must first comprehend the figure standing on the battlements. Vercingetorix was an aberration in the turbulent tribal environment of Gaul. Before his emergence, the Gallic tribes were their own greatest adversaries, perpetually feuding, plundering each other, and betraying their neighbours to Rome for a few silver coins. Vercingetorix altered the calculation. He was a chieftain of the Arverni tribe, and he wielded an uncommon fusion of political magnetism and merciless military order. He constructed a confederation through violence and steel, notoriously disciplining uncertain chieftains by severing their ears or removing their eyes. He insisted on absolute solidarity because he recognized precisely what was advancing toward them. By 52 BC, the Gallic campaigns had persisted for 6 savage years. The Roman apparatus appeared invincible. But just months before Alesia, something unprecedented occurred. The apparatus fractured. The location was Gergovia, another hilltop stronghold, much like Alesia. There Caesar had endeavoured to crush the insurrection with his characteristic tactic, aggression. He attempted to storm the heights. He presumed the barbarians would crumble under the discipline of the legions. He was mistaken. Vercingetorix exploited the elevated terrain effectively, containing the Romans and launching counter-offensives that hurled the legions into disarray. For the first time, the invincible Julius Caesar tasted defeat. He sacrificed nearly 700 troops, including 46 centurions, the foundation of his military. The Romans were compelled to retreat in humiliation. This triumph transmitted a shockwave across the ancient world. It demonstrated that Caesar was mortal. It demonstrated that Rome could hemorrhage. And most perilously, it persuaded Vercingetorix that he had discovered the formula to vanquish the empire. Refuse open confrontation, withdraw to a fortified elevation, sever Roman supply chains, and allow the legions to shatter themselves against the defences. This success at Gergovia became the architect of Vercingetorix's catastrophe at Alesia. When the Roman legions resumed pursuing him later that summer, the Gallic warlord didn't flee into the dense wilderness or disperse his forces to execute guerrilla operations. He examined the map and identified Alesia. It was Gergovia replicated, but superior. The plateau was more expansive, the defences were taller, and the water reserves were plentiful. He believed he was establishing the identical trap that had functioned previously. He would entice Caesar in, allow the Romans to exhaust themselves in futile assaults, and then crush them. Vercingetorix marched his 80,000 warriors onto the Mandubii plateau with confidence. Radiating from him, he relocated the indigenous population. He stockpiled the granaries. He prepared for a magnificent defensive engagement. He gazed down at the valley and anticipated Caesar to replicate the identical error he committed at Gergovia. But he failed to account for his adversary's adaptability. Caesar was a man who absorbed lessons from his wounds. The disgrace at Gergovia had incinerated any arrogance the Roman general might have possessed regarding siege assaults. Caesar examined Alesia and instantly recognized that storming the defences would be a massacre for his forces. He likely perceived the phantoms of his deceased centurions from Gergovia cautioning him against a frontal assault. So when Vercingetorix gazed down from the ramparts on that initial day, anticipating to witness scaling ladders and battering rams, he witnessed something infinitely more terrifying. He witnessed surveyors. He witnessed engineers hammering stakes into the soil to calculate distances. He witnessed the legions establishing the perimeter for a barrier of their own. Caesar had transformed the contest. He wasn't going to combat Vercingetorix. He was going to disregard him. The psychological impact on the Gallic forces cannot be exaggerated. These were fighters raised on a tradition of personal courage and individual combat. They craved to charge, to clash weapons, to bellow their war chants. Instead, they were compelled to observe the Romans excavate trenches. Day after day, the Roman perimeter constricted like a python. There were no magnificent charges to deflect. There were no adversaries to slaughter. there was only the sound of 50,000 shovels displacing earth, constructing a prison that would starve them to extinction. Vercingetorix comprehended his miscalculation too late. The strategy that conquered Gergovia was worthless here because Caesar refused to execute his role in the scenario. The king of the Gauls had sealed himself in a cage, surrendered the key to his enemy, and challenged him to combat. Caesar simply secured the door and departed to construct a wall. The trap at Gergovia had depended on Roman aggression. The trap at Alesia depended on Roman patience. And Caesar, with his career hanging in the balance, possessed infinite patience. The command ripples down the formation. 50,000 shields are stacked aside. 50,000 pila are planted in the ground. In their position, the legions withdraw their dolabra, the massive pickaxe mattock that represents Roman authority as much as the eagle standard. The strategy here is ruthless in its elegance. If you cannot eliminate the adversary with steel, you bury him with soil. The labour commences with a velocity that defies comprehension. These troops are not merely soldiers, they are the most exceptional construction teams in the ancient world. Within hours, the verdant valley floor is carved open. The initial incision is a colossal trench, 20 feet in width, excavated specifically at the mountain's base. Caesar commands the walls of this excavation to be perpendicular, not sloped. He desires a tank barrier, a sheer descent designed to shatter the legs of any horse that attempts to leap it. This is the stopping barrier, a physical obstruction to prevent Vercingetorix's cavalry from assaulting the Roman labourers behind it. Inside Alesia, the atmosphere transitions from ridicule to terror. Vercingetorix observes the brown scar of the earthworks extending by the hour. He recognizes he cannot permit the Romans to complete this noose. He commands his cavalry, the elite nobility of the Gallic tribes, to mount up. They thunder down the slopes, intending to butcher the legionaries, while they are waist-deep in the muck. This is the first genuine test of the siege. A turbulent, swirling melee detonates in the space between the mountain and the excavations. Roman labourers abandon their shovels, seize their shields, and form compact defensive clusters. But Caesar has anticipated this. He releases his own secret weapon, Germanic cavalry. These are mercenaries hired from across the Rhine, savage horsemen who ride alongside the legions. They crash into the Gallic charge with brutality. The skirmish is gory and frantic, fought in the shadow of the ascending barriers. The Gauls are repelled, abandoning their casualties in the very excavations the Romans are digging. But the raid exposes a terrifying truth to Vercingetorix. The Roman perimeter is solidifying. Once the primary wall is completed, his cavalry, his swiftest units, will be worthless. They will be imprisoned inside, consuming rations that his infantry requires. He executes a critical decision. Under the concealment of a moonless night, before the Roman ring is completely sealed, Vercingetorix commands his entire cavalry force to break through. It is a gamble of supreme stakes. Thousands of horsemen silently navigate their way through a gap in the incomplete Roman defences. They slip past the sleeping sentries and gallop into the darkness. Their instructions are straightforward. Ride to every tribe in Gaul. Inform them their warlord is imprisoned. Inform them to bring every able-bodied warrior who can wield a spear. Return and annihilate Caesar. Caesar awakens to the intelligence. At dawn, the birds have escaped. He examines the tracks leading away from Alesia and instantly comprehends the implications. The clock has ignited. The Roman legion is no longer merely besieging a fortress. They are now the target of a massive rescue operation. The hunters are about to become the hunted. Most commanders would panic. They would perceive the vulnerability of their position, exposed in open territory, awaiting 250,000 furious Gauls to arrive. Caesar does not panic. He summons his engineers. He gestures to the empty fields behind his forces, away from Alesia. "We have imprisoned them in," he might have declared. "Now we must imprison them out." The plan is expanded. The legions will not cease excavating. They will construct a second line of fortifications oriented outward, creating a massive fortified ring. The army will reside, sleep, and combat in the narrow corridor between these two barriers. It is a tactical madness, a feat of engineering hubris that has no precedent in history. The soldiers groan, their hands blistered, their spines aching, but they excavate. They recognize that when the relief force arrives, these barriers will be the only thing standing between them and obliteration. The cage is snapped shut, but now Caesar must reinforce the bars before the tempest strikes. Let's traverse the killing zone. If you were a Gallic warrior attempting to assault the Roman defences, you wouldn't simply rush into a wall. You would have to navigate a meticulously designed obstacle course of death. This is the contravallation, the inner ring facing Vercingetorix, and it remains one of the most savage examples of military engineering ever conceived. First, you confront the trenches, not merely one, but two parallel excavations, each 15 feet in width and equally deep. The inner one is filled with water diverted from the local rivers, creating a stagnant, muddy barrier. If you manage to swim across that, you confront the rampart itself, a 12-foot high wall of compressed earth topped with a palisade and battlements. But the wall isn't merely wood and soil. It is bristling with valley, sharp wooden stakes projecting horizontally to prevent anyone from scaling over. Every 80 feet, a 3-story wooden tower looms over you, manned by archers and scorpion artillery teams. But the genuine genius and cruelty of Caesar's design lies in what sits in front of the trenches. Caesar recognized he was outnumbered. He couldn't man every inch of the wall at all times, so he constructed automated defences. He transformed the landscape into a minefield that didn't require explosives. Closest to the wall, we discover the Sipi. These are massive tree trunks buried deep in the ground, with their heavy branches sharpened into points and interlaced. They resemble the antlers of a colossal stag. They're designed to hold you in position, to entangle your formation, so the Roman archers on the wall can eliminate you at their leisure. If you survive the Sipi, you step into the field of lilies which we encountered earlier. 8 rows of these funnel shafts arranged in a checkerboard pattern. But there's more. Buried in the grass ahead of the lilies are the stimuli. These are the most insidious of all. They are simple blocks of wood with iron-barbed hooks driven into them, buried entirely underground, with only the hook protruding slightly above the soil. Think of them as ancient landmines. You can't perceive them. You step on one and the hook drives into the sole of your foot. When you instinctively pull your leg upward, the barb tears through nerves and muscle. A warrior crippled by a stimulus isn't dead. He is screaming, writhing on the ground, becoming an obstacle to the warriors behind him, and a drain on the morale of his entire unit. Caesar's troops planted thousands of these. They created a no-man's land, roughly 400 yards in width. This was not a fair confrontation, it was a meat grinder. The Romans called these traps by innocent names. Lilies because they resembled flowers. Sipi meaning grave markers. It was a dark soldierly humour. Inside the fortifications, the legionaries laboured with the precision of watchmakers. They weren't merely excavating, they were manufacturing a landscape of terror. Every stake was sharpened to a needlepoint, and fire hardened to prevent decay and increase hardness. Every trench was measured precisely. They displaced millions of cubic feet of earth, not with machinery, but with baskets and muscle fueled by vinegar water and grain. For the Gauls observing from the heights, the psychological impact was devastating. They witnessed their sacred land being mutilated, turned against them. They realized that to reach the Romans, they would have to wade through a sea of concealed blades. Caesar had effectively informed them, "Come and get me, but you will bleed before you even perceive the whites of my eyes." By the time the second wall, the circumvallation facing outward, was completed, the Romans had constructed a total of nearly 25 miles of fortifications. They had enclosed themselves in a stronghold of their own creation. The stage was established. The machine was constructed. Now it just needed to be fed. While the inner walls suffocated Vercingetorix, a new threat was expanding on the horizon. The Gallic cavalry had accomplished their objective. The call to arms had spread like wildfire across the forests of Gaul. From the foggy coasts of Armorica to the mountains of the Arverni, tribes that had been adversaries for centuries put aside their blood feuds. They united for a single purpose: to crush the Roman invader. A massive relief force estimated by Caesar at 250,000 warriors, though modern historians suggest a still staggering 100,000, began the march toward Alesia. Caesar was now in a race against physics. He had to complete a second wall before this tsunami crashed into his rear. This was the circumvallation. If the inner wall was a prison, the outer wall was a fortress. It stretched for 14 miles, encompassing the entire Roman operation. The legionaries were now residing in a thin strip of land between two hostile perimeters. Imagine a long fortified corridor wrapping around a mountain. Inside this corridor lived 50,000 troops, thousands of horses, and all their provisions. They were the besiegers, yet they were also the besieged. The psychological strain of this position was unique. Usually, a besieging force sits comfortably in the countryside, raiding farms and sleeping securely. Here the Romans were imprisoned. They had to forage for provisions and water in a shrinking territory. Every foraging party dispatched was a gamble. If they wandered too far, they would be picked off by Gallic scouts. If they stayed too close, they would starve. Caesar commanded the identical deadly jewellery to be installed on the outer wall: the trenches, the cipi, the stimuli. He effectively created a two-front conflict where the fronts were back-to-back. A Roman soldier standing on the ramparts could glance over his left shoulder and observe Vercingetorix's starving troops, and glance over his right shoulder to perceive the dust cloud of the approaching relief force. Vercingetorix, from his elevated perch, could observe the second wall ascending. It must have been a bittersweet sight. On one hand, it confirmed that assistance was coming. Why else would Caesar construct it? On the other hand, it meant that the relief force wouldn't merely be marching into a confrontation. They would be marching into a meat grinder. The king of the Gauls had hoped for a hammer and anvil strike, smashing the Romans against his mountain. Instead, Caesar had constructed a shield that faced both directions. Within the Roman camp, discipline became the only religion. Mark Antony and Gaius Trebonius, Caesar's lieutenants, rode the length of the defences inspecting fortifications. They recognised that once the assault commenced, there would be no reinforcements. There was no Rome to summon for assistance. If the outer wall breached, they would be slaughtered. If the inner wall breached, they would be slaughtered. The genius of the circumvallation was not merely in its height or thickness, but in its denial of momentum. The incoming Gallic relief force would be exhausted from the march. They would have to cross the zone of death under fire, breach the wall, and then combat fresh Roman legionaries. And even if they broke through, they would find themselves in a killing box, wedged between the two walls. As the days transformed into weeks, the silence grew oppressive. The construction noise faded. The walls were completed. The traps were established. The Roman army waited in their fortified ring, listening to the wind, checking their pila and watching the horizon. They were 50,000 troops alone in a hostile nation, encased in wood and earth, waiting for the world to end. Inside the walls of Alesia, the adversary was no longer the Romans. It was time. Vercingetorix had calculated his provisions for 30 days. 30 days had elapsed. The relief force was nowhere to be witnessed. The grain silos were empty. The cattle had been slaughtered. Panic began to replace discipline. The Gallic council convened in a grim atmosphere. Some chieftains suggested surrender. Others, like the Arvernian noble Critonatus, proposed a horrific solution: cannibalism. He argued that they should consume those too elderly or too weak to fight to sustain the warriors. Why not, he might have asked. We are fighting for freedom. Vercingetorix rejected cannibalism, but his alternative was hardly more humane. He decided to purge the fortress of useless mouths. This meant the elderly, the infirm, the women, and the children. Most tragic of all, these were not strangers. These were the Mandubii, the local tribe who had owned this town, who had opened their gates to Vercingetorix and welcomed his forces. Now, in return for their hospitality, they were being expelled from their own homes. The gates of Alesia creaked open. Thousands of Mandubii civilians shuffled out, carrying their meagre possessions, moving down the slope toward the Roman defences. They wept, but there was a flicker of hope. They believed that Caesar, a representative of civilized Rome, would take pity on them. They expected to be taken as slaves, a terrible fate, but better than starvation. At the very least, they thought he would permit them to pass through the defences to the countryside. They reached the Roman trenches and gazed up at the legionaries on the ramparts. They begged for bread. They begged for enslavement. Caesar gazed down from his fortifications. His decision was instantaneous and frigid. He was not operating a charity. He was operating a siege. Every mouth he fed was a day's rations taken from his soldiers. If he permitted them to pass, he would lose the psychological leverage over Vercingetorix. He wanted the king of the Gauls to observe his own people suffer. Caesar commanded the gates to remain barred. The Mandubii turned back to Alesia, screaming for Vercingetorix to permit them to return. But the Gallic warlord, steeling himself for the confrontation to come, refused to open the gates. He could not afford to feed them, and so the Mandubii were imprisoned in the no-man's land between the two armies. The starvation tactics employed here reached a level of cruelty that is difficult to stomach, even 2,000 years later. For days, the civilians wandered the killing fields. They consumed the grass. They gnawed on leather and bark. Wives held up their starving infants to the walls, pleading with their husbands inside the fortress and the Romans outside. Both sides observed. The Roman legionaries, hardened warriors who had witnessed everything, had to stand guard and listen to the slow, agonizing death of thousands of innocents just yards away. The Gauls on the walls had to observe their families wither and die in the muck. It was a psychological torture designed to break the will of the defenders, but it also hardened the hearts of the Romans. By the time the relief force finally arrived, the cries from the ditch had largely stopped. The Mandubii were gone, reduced to corpses littering the obstacle course of Caesar's traps. This mass death served as a gruesome prelude to the final confrontation. It stripped away any illusion of honour. There was no chivalry remaining at Alesia. There was only the raw biological imperative to survive at any cost. The silence of the dead was finally broken, not by screams, but by the rumble of the earth. On the horizon, the standards of the relief force finally appeared. The cavalry arrived first, followed by an ocean of infantry. The outer wall was about to be tested. The starving warriors inside Alesia heard the commotion and grabbed their weapons with trembling hands. The waiting was over. The apocalypse had arrived. The horizon didn't merely shift, it came alive. The relief force, commanded by Commius and Vercingetorix's cousin, Vercingetorix, spilled into the plain like an avalanche. Caesar estimated their numbers at 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even if modern historians trim those numbers, the Roman legionaries were staring at a force 4 times their size. The ground physically vibrated. The shouting of the warriors, the beating of shields, and the blaring of the carnix, the terrifying Celtic war trumpets, created a wall of sound that drowned out orders. This was the defining moment of the Battle of Alesia. The trap was fully activated. Vercingetorix, observing from the citadel, witnessed the signal fire. He commanded his starving troops to throw open the gates. They didn't march out. They poured out, carrying ladders, hurdles to cover the trenches, and a desperate famine-fueled rage. For the Roman soldier, the nightmare had become reality. A legionary on the wall would hurl his pilum at the charging relief force, pivot 180 degrees, and draw his gladius to hack at Vercingetorix's warriors climbing up from the inside. The thin strip of land between the two walls became a pressure cooker. The first assault was a test of the engineering. The Gallic relief force charged blindly into the kill zone we described earlier. The results were horrific. Horses impaled themselves on the concealed stakes. Waves of warriors fell into the lilies, their legs snapping like dry twigs, only to be trampled by the waves of warriors behind them. The Roman scorpions, giant sniper crossbows, punched holes through the dense Gallic ranks. But the Gauls had numbers. They threw bundles of brushwood into the trenches to create bridges. They tossed earth over the concealed spikes. They were paving a road with their own equipment and their own dead. Caesar stood at an elevated vantage point, arguably the busiest individual in the ancient world. He wasn't fighting, he was conducting. He observed for flags, listened for trumpets, and shifted his cohorts like chess pieces. Wherever the line buckled, he dispatched reserves. The Gallic wars had produced a force that could maneuver with fluid precision, even in total chaos. Nightfall brought no relief. Under the cover of darkness, the relief force launched a second massive wave. They brought grappling hooks and siege engines. The Romans, unable to perceive the enemy, hurled their heavy pila blindly into the darkness, aiming at the roar of the crowd. The screams of warriors pierced by the heavy javelins echoed through the valley. Inside the ring, the pressure was reaching a breaking point. Vercingetorix's warriors were tearing at the inner wall, filling the moat with clay and wood. The contest became a brutal grind of stamina. The Romans were fighting for their lives, knowing there was nowhere to flee. The Gauls were fighting for their existence, knowing this was their last chance to break the Roman yoke. By the morning of the second day, the assaults were repelled, but the cost was high. The Roman defences held, but they were thin. Tens of thousands of Gallic bodies littered the traps, rendering the stimuli and lilies useless. They were now buried under a carpet of corpses. The engineering advantage was gone. The Gallic commanders realised that brute force against the walls was failing. They stopped. They scouted. And then they discovered it. To the north, there was a flaw. The Roman defences could not completely enclose a steep hill called Mount Rhea. Due to the rugged terrain, the wall there was on lower ground, vulnerable, and guarded by only 2 legions. The Gauls didn't merely send a raiding party. They sent 60,000 of their best warriors, the super heavyweights of the relief force, to hammer this single crack in the armour. They moved at night, hiding behind the hill, waiting for high noon to unleash the death blow. The ocean of steel was about to funnel into a single devastating stream. High noon. The sun beat down on Mount Rhea. Suddenly, the hillside erupted. 60,000 Gallic warriors, led by Vercingetorix, charged down the slope, smashing into the 2 Roman legions, defending the weak point. At the exact same moment, Vercingetorix witnessed the movement and commanded a massive assault from the inside against the same section of the wall. The Roman defenders were caught in a vice. The fortifications at Mount Rhea were incomplete, sitting on unfavourable ground. The Gauls tore down the ramparts, filled the trenches, and began to overwhelm the legionaries through sheer weight of numbers. Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant holding the line, dispatched a desperate runner to his commander. "The line is breaking. We cannot hold." This was the crisis point. If Mount Rhea fell, the Roman army would be split in 2 and slaughtered. Caesar dispatched wave after wave of reinforcements, first under Brutus, then under Gaius Fabius. They were swallowed up by the chaos. The Roman morale began to crack. Soldiers glanced over their shoulders, witnessing their ocean of enemies, and started to waver. It was then that Julius Caesar played his final card. He didn't dispatch another general. He went himself. He grabbed the last few cohorts of reserves, troops exhausted, wounded, and terrified. He summoned his personal bodyguard and his squadron of Germanic cavalry. And then he executed something purely theatrical, yet psychologically brilliant. He donned his paludamentum, the scarlet general's cloak that marked him as the commander-in-chief. In the dust and grey confusion of battle, that spot of bright red was a beacon. Caesar rode directly into the melee. The effect was electric. The Roman legionaries, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, witnessed their general fighting alongside them. They witnessed the man who paid their wages, who knew their names, risking his life in the mud. The shame of retreating while Caesar advanced was too great. The lines stiffened. The pila were thrown aside. Swords were drawn for close-quarters butchery. But courage alone couldn't stop 60,000 warriors. The Gauls were winning. They pushed the Romans back step by bloody step. What neither the Gauls nor the Romans perceived was the ghost in the machine. While Caesar distracted the enemy front with his suicidal charge, his Germanic cavalry had silently circled wide around the back of the hill. Just as the Gallic victory seemed inevitable, a thunderous roar erupted from behind them. The Germanic horsemen smashed into the rear of the Gallic relief force. Panic is a contagion. In ancient warfare, an army is a beast that faces forward. When it is attacked from behind, the beast dies. The Gauls at the rear screamed and broke rank. The panic rippled forward like a wave. The warriors attacking Caesar suddenly felt the pressure from behind. The momentum shifted in a heartbeat. The Romans, energized by Caesar's presence and the sight of the enemy wavering, surged forward. The double trap had inverted. The besiegers were now the ones surrounded. The slaughter that followed was mechanical and absolute. The relief force didn't merely retreat, they dissolved. Cut down by the cavalry, trampled by their own comrades, they fled into the forests. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix observed the disaster unfold. He witnessed the scarlet cloak. He witnessed his cousin's massive force, his last hope, shatter like glass against the Roman shield wall. He witnessed the Germanic cavalry hunting down the survivors. The noise of battle slowly faded, replaced by the groans of the dying and the cheers of the legions. The sun set on a field choked with bodies. Caesar stood on the ramparts of Mount Rhea, his red cloak stained with dust, gazing at the retreating backs of the Gauls. He had gambled everything, his life, his army, his legacy, on a single charge, and he had won. The relief force was gone. Vercingetorix was alone. The sun rose on a changed world. The plain outside Alesia, once teeming with 250,000 warriors, was empty. The relief force had vanished into the forests, their spirit broken, leaving only corpses and carrion birds behind. Inside the fortress, the silence was absolute. There was no food, there was no hope. The gamble had failed. Vercingetorix convened his council one final time. According to Caesar's own commentaries, the Gallic warlord spoke with a tragic nobility. He told his chieftains that he had not fought for his own private gain, but for the liberty of Gaul. He acknowledged that they must now yield to fortune. He offered them a choice: kill him to appease the Romans, or hand him over alive. They chose the latter. They dispatched envoys to Caesar to request terms. Caesar's response was brief and brutal. Hand over your weapons, bring out your leaders. He established his tribunal seat in the fortifications, likely between the two walls that had strangled the rebellion. He sat there, not standing to greet an equal, but seated as a judge awaiting a criminal. What followed is a scene that has been painted, sculpted, and dramatized for 2,000 years. The gates of Alesia opened. Vercingetorix rode out alone. He did not come as a beggar. He came as a king. He wore his finest armor, silver and bronze, gleaming in the sun. His horse was groomed to perfection. He rode down the slope through the Roman lines and approached the tribunal. Historians like Plutarch describe a strange ritualistic moment. Vercingetorix didn't dismount immediately. He rode his horse in a circle around Caesar's chair. It was a final display of horsemanship, a silent reminder of the Gallic culture that was about to be extinguished. Then he dismounted. He unbuckled his sword. He stripped off his ornate armor. Piece by piece, the surrender transformed from a political negotiation into a physical stripping of power. He threw his weapons and armour onto the ground at Caesar's feet, and then he sat down in the dirt, silent and motionless. This was the moment of ultimate humiliation. In many ancient cultures, a defeated general might expect death or perhaps a respectful embrace from a worthy adversary. Caesar offered neither. He did not speak to Vercingetorix. He did not offer him a hand. He simply signalled to his guards. The king of the Gauls was seized, chained like a common thief, and dragged away. For Caesar, this was the final seal on his conquest. He paraded his enemy to show the people that the threat was gone, that the barbarian was tamed. But once the parade reached the end of its route near the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the pageantry ended. The procession turned right up to the capital. Vercingetorix was left back to the Tullianum. There were no speeches, there was no trial. In the dim light of the dungeon, a state executioner looped a garrote around the king's neck. With a quick, brutal twist, the resistance of Gaul was strangled. His body was likely thrown down the stairs to be abused by the public or tossed into the Tiber River. It was an unceremonious end for a man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees. But while Vercingetorix died, his legacy underwent a strange transformation. Caesar had intended to erase him, but by writing about him extensively, in his commentaries to glorify his own victory, Caesar accidentally immortalized his enemy. He made Vercingetorix a worthy opponent to boost his own prestige, and in doing so, he preserved the name of the Gallic king for eternity. The Siege of Alesia reshaped the world map. Gaul became a loyal province. The Gallic aristocracy learned Latin, wore togas, and built bathhouses. Within a few generations, the distinct Celtic culture was absorbed into the Roman machine, creating the Gallo-Roman hybrid that would eventually give birth to modern France. Today, if you visit the site of Alesia, you will see a massive statue of Vercingetorix erected by Napoleon III in the 19th century. He stands tall, leaning on his shield, looking out over the valley where he lost everything. He's no longer a barbarian rebel. He is the first national hero of France. As for Caesar, Alesia was his masterpiece. It proved that Roman military engineering and ruthless pragmatism could overcome any odds. It gave him the wealth, the loyalty of his legions, and the political clout to overthrow the Republic. But there is a grim irony here. Just 2 years after he strangled Vercingetorix, Caesar himself would be butchered by his own friends on the Senate floor. The conqueror and the conquered met similar, violent ends, consumed by the relentless grinder of history. So as we look back at the concentric walls of Alesia, at the hidden traps and the starving civilians, we are left with a difficult question. We often marvel at the genius of Rome, at the roads and the aqueducts, but Alesia reminds us that civilization is often built on a foundation of bones. Before you go, I have one question for you to answer in the comments. In this story, was Vercingetorix a hero who doomed his people by fighting a war he couldn't win? Or was he a martyr who proved that freedom is worth any price? I'll be down there debating with you. If you found value in this deep dive, please subscribe and ring the bell. We have many more lost stories to uncover. Until then, remember, history is not just names and dates, it is the study of survival.